Hello and welcome to The Food Chain with me, Manuela Zaragoza. In this programme, sit back, relax. We're going all natural, taking nature's way. Except when it comes to food, what does natural actually mean?
It's all about subjective use of language. It's about products that tell a story that romance the consumer by talking about homemade, handmade, artisanal values, things like that.
And is natural really always the best and healthiest option?
If we were to have a completely natural diet, our diets would actually be quite limited in this day and age. We are so used to having such a variety of foods.
We ask, do food manufacturers set out to deliberately confuse us with their labels?
It's so silly that we see so many labels that say no added hormones for chicken because it's not allowed. I mean, this whole thing really comes down to marketing.
All will be revealed here on The Food Chain from the BBC. Think natural and perhaps this springs to mind. The crystal clear waters of a stream. Birds singing in a forest. Or if you're like me, the nighttime call of crickets. We think we know what natural is, but when it comes to food and food marketing, it's a surprisingly difficult notion to pin down. Let's start with the dictionary definition.
Natural, adjective, existing or present by nature, inherent in the very constitution of a person or thing, innate, not acquired or assumed.
That's from the Oxford English Dictionary. But so confusing is defining natural in food that earlier this year America's food regulators, the FDA, issued a public call for comments on what exactly the word should mean. We'll have more on that later. First though, why does it matter? Well, every year food companies around the world sell tens of billions of dollars worth of product labelled as natural.
It's become such a mainstream part of the total food and drink market that it's really difficult to separate products that do make those claims from ones that don't.
David Jago is Director of Global Insight and Innovation at the market intelligence company Mintel. He says it's not just the word natural that sells, but others too, words that shoppers associate with natural.
We measure new product launches and we look at the language used on pack for new products coming to market. And if we look globally over the last 4 years, the term homemade has seen a 64% increase. Authentic as a phrase on front of pack is up 80% in the same time frame. Pure is up, fresh is up. All those terms are getting more common on food and drink packaging and in every part of the world.
Where does it come from, this sort of trend that people want more natural product?
It comes from a couple of areas, really. I think, first of all, there's a good degree of consumer distrust in the food and drink industry. Food scares have always been around. They're not new, but food scares take away consumers' confidence in the safety of the food that they're provided with. And it's natural, I think, for the consumer to see that something that's more natural and less processed is perhaps better for them. But it's also fair to say that those types of terms also are a way of denoting quality. So as companies are looking to get a competitive edge over other brands, they're looking to use more words that suggest their product's better quality than someone else's.
Because natural it's a slippery term.
It's very slippery. It is legislated in some areas, in some markets. You can't get away with putting natural in everything. And in fact, in many parts of the European Union, for example, it's quite regulated. You can talk about natural sweeteners, you can talk about natural colours and natural flavours, but it's quite a difficult piece of language to use otherwise.
But that's key, isn't it? You can have sweeteners, you can have flavours, and still call something natural.
Absolutely. It is confusing because it's so ubiquitous. You see very small, local, organic brands talking about natural. You see huge multinational brands in supermarkets talking about natural as well. If you look at it on a global level, 16% of all new food and drink products have some sort of form of natural language on front of pack.
16%?
16%. In the UK, it's 1 in 4. It's all about subjective use of language, but it's about products that tell a story that romance the consumer in one way or another by talking about homemade, handmade, artisanal values, things like that. And that's something which once was very much restricted to the small specialist players, but is now being adopted by the big guys. So we see Haagen-Dazs with an artisan ice cream, for example. We see Nestle with a mainstream brand of chocolate in Europe, which is called L'Atelier, which is the workshop. And the whole point is it looks
It's
kind of
French for the
handcrafted.
workshop, l'atelier. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it looks handcrafted. It looks like it's made in a workshop. It's made in a Nestle factory alongside other Nestle chocolate products. But it's using that sort of language and using the visual appearance sometimes of products and even the colour of the packaging to emphasise something which is perhaps a little bit more natural.
David Jago of Mintel. Two significant points there. Packaging matters when it comes to natural, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But also, it's often said that the consumer is intelligent enough to be able to differentiate between what is truly natural and what isn't. Not everyone agrees. Food activists in the US state of Vermont, for example. Earlier this year, Vermont passed the country's first law requiring products containing genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, to carry the information on the packaging. The law was in place for exactly 3 weeks. It was overturned by less strict federal legislation. Hilary Niles reports.
My cow herd is Black and Red Angus, Hereford, and Charolais, which is a French breed. There's one over here.
On 600 acres overlooking the sparkling Lake Champlain to the west and New York's Adirondack Mountains beyond the far shore, 29-year-old Wallace Greenwald is adapting his beef cattle operation in line with consumer demand.
The brisket is in between the two front legs. It looks like just a big floppy hunk of meat sticking out of the front of the cow.
The prior owner had been raising about 1,000 head of cattle and using growth hormones to do it. Now, Wallace raises just 600 cattle free of hormones and antibiotics. He sells the animals mostly to local packers who market the food as natural.
The local buyers, they hear from their customers that they want antibiotic, hormone-free, quote-unquote natural cattle, so that's what they want to buy.
Wallace says he made the switch mostly to meet that demand and also for personal reasons.
I'm not like the organic champion super duper. I just don't think you need to really mess with cattle. If you leave a cow and her calf alone, as long as they have enough grass and water, they'll do pretty well.
He estimates that about 5% more expense goes into raising the animals this way. But Wallace makes about 20% more off their sales, which allowed him to reduce the herd.
They're called feeder cattle. It's kind of like a class of cattle. We get them all together and we feed them fairly concentrated ration.
That feed is a mixture of fresh, dried, and fermented hay, which Wallace grows himself, and corn that he buys. And here's where things get confusing. Does natural describe just the meat, or does the definition include the feed used to raise the animal whose meat you're buying? And what exactly does natural mean, anyway?
It might mean something completely different to a person that sees the label than what's actually happening.
This is Joe Emenheiser. He's a farm manager now, but until this summer, Joe worked for the University of Vermont's Agricultural Extension Service. In that role, Joe traveled around the state to advise farmers and gardeners on raising their livestock. Through the Extension Service and other programs like it, farmers and gardeners can access a lot of educational resources, Joe says. But consumers are less informed and therefore often base their food choices more on assumptions than facts. Take growth hormones, for instance. According to both industry and regulatory sources, use of synthetic hormones is widespread in beef and dairy farming. I asked Joe about hormones for chicken.
Not legal.
Oh, it's not legal for poultry?
Not legal, which is why it's so silly that we see so many labels that say no added hormones for chicken, because it's not allowed. I mean, this whole thing really comes down to marketing.
And marketing matters because, for the most part, people in the U.S. don't farm, they buy. About 320 million Americans rely on just 3.2 million farmers and ranchers to produce the country's food. That's according to the most recent U.S. agricultural census from 2012. And figures from the Department of Agriculture state that almost 20% of what Americans eat is imported.
There needs to be a certain amount of trust or transparency or understanding. But that labeling is also not realistic unless the population that's benefiting from the labeling understands what it means.
So do they? I visited the Village Market in Waterbury, Vermont, to ask shoppers about their food choices. Like most I spoke with, Melissa Gorham says she knows the Food and Drug Administration doesn't regulate use of the term natural. The FDA, as it's known, is the country's top regulator of foods and drugs.
Natural's. Can you define natural for me? Natural isn't something that I necessarily look for because that's just a play on words.
Instead, natural food is something Melissa looks for by reading labels more closely.
Hormone-free, antibiotic-free, sure.
Then there's food that contains genetically modified organisms.
GMOs, oh man. That's a whole other topic. I prefer not to have GMOs in my food, but sometimes, that isn't on the label.
GMO ingredients almost were on food labels, in Vermont anyway. The state passed a law in 2014 that would have required such labeling for all food sold in the state. The law also prohibited products with GMO ingredients from being labeled as natural. Vermont's law would have gone into effect this summer, but a federal law with looser labeling requirements is taking its place.
I'm bummed out about that ruling.
But Gorham figures that by shopping local, she avoids GMOs altogether.
A lot of these farms, you can read about them, you hear about them from friends, they have a lot of integrity, so hopefully they're knowingly not feeding their animals GMO.
That may be wishful thinking. National figures from the U.S. Department of Agriculture indicate that more than 90% of the country's corn crop is genetically modified. Joe Emenheiser from Vermont's Extension Service says there's one surefire way to know what you're eating.
The only way to know what goes into your food is to put it in yourself.
Next best, he says, get to know your local farms. Because in the end, as simple as food may look, no label can fully convey all that goes into producing it.
Hilary Niles reporting. A reminder that you're listening to The Food Chain from the BBC, where we're asking what exactly natural means when it comes to food and food labelling. As our guest David Jago mentioned earlier, the reason it's become a contentious question is because so many consumers don't entirely trust the food they buy and eat.
Horse meat found in burgers sold in British and Irish supermarkets. Tesco, Iceland and several others are taking the product off the shelves.
The adulteration scandal raises serious questions for the government to answer about how we as a nation regulate our food.
The packaging says beef, but the contents could be 100% horse meat. Supermarkets in different European countries have been clearing their shelves of products.
That breakdown in trust came to a head in 2013 when it emerged that some beef being sold in Europe was contaminated with horse meat. While that scandal turned out to be an issue of food fraud, consumer confidence in food labelling was also shaken. Retailers have since been working hard to win back trust. But more recently, food labels were again in the news.
I'm Tom Levitt. I work for The Guardian and I write about food and environmental issues.
So, Tom, I've got one packet of sausages, one packet of pork loin steaks in front of me. The pork loin steaks, they're from Tesco and it says on it Woodside Farms. And the sausages have got on it a nice picture of a country cottage.
Yeah, we've got a little bit less pictures on the Woodside Farm, but I think the Woodside Farm, they focused on that name being enough for us to get that illusion of provenance and Britishness.
The problem is only one of the farms mentioned on those particular packets there is real. The other doesn't actually exist.
It's a fictional farm, yeah. It's a brand. It's designed to do two things. One, to give the consumer this illusion of provenance and to make them think they're buying something British, but also to give Tesco or whoever else creates these fictional farm names the kind of flexibility to source from anywhere, because they don't want to just source from one farm. And to be fair, one farm, unless it was pretty large, couldn't supply all of Tesco's pork loin steak needs. But they want the flexibility to source from anywhere, whether it's cheaper, whether they want to go around the world. But it is slightly misleading, because if you see the Woodside Farm, there's a big label at the top and you have to look very, very small letters there. What does it say? Reared. I can only barely read it.
Denmark, slaughtered in Denmark.
Very
small writing at the bottom.
And there's no Danish flag or anything to help us realise that.
There was a furore about this sort of branding earlier this year. How did Tesco respond?
The Tesco CEO coincidentally had their AGM a few weeks later after this branding and the media furore that followed. And he at the time said, don't be ridiculous. Consumers are savvy enough to understand that these are fictional farming names and we don't need to change anything. And they also can quite say that, look, we clearly are honest on the front of the packaging by saying it's from Denmark. However, that's not how we shop. We shop quickly, we're in a rush. We just look at labels, Woodside Farm, pork, brilliant, that's great, that sounds British. I feel happy, I feel comfortable buying that. Very rarely do we spend time looking at the labels and thinking through the implications of what we're buying, thinking through, well, this comes from Denmark, so would that mean there's a farm in Denmark called Woodside? Woodside, is that an English-sounding name? And you just don't think through those implications. You don't think through the backstory. You just make a snap decision. So, I mean, it's clever marketing. They know that we care about provenance, but they also know that we don't spend time necessarily looking into the backstory. So we're happy just to sort of pick things up on first glance.
The Guardian's Tom Levitt. In the US, consumers who feel misled by labels have taken things further. Food manufacturers have been slapped with lawsuits accusing them of misusing the word natural on their packaging. The complaint is that many products contain ingredients that a typical consumer wouldn't think of as natural. Ingredients like high fructose corn syrup, artificial flavours and colourings, chemical preservatives and GMOs. It's all good business for lawyers, and for organic food activists, it's a chance to poke fun at the whole natural food movement.
I'd like to say that creating the natural label is an art, but it's not.
Listen to this spoof by Only Organic.
Your product may contain growth hormones and antibiotics. Just throw that word natural on there. Maybe add a picture of a barn. We can put the natural label on pretty much anything.
Clearly, there's a lot of room for confusion. So much so that some food and drinks companies, including Pepsi and Campbell's Soups, decided to quietly drop the word natural from their labels in 2013, according to a Wall Street Journal report. In the meantime, though, judges overseeing those lawsuits in America asked the FDA to come up with a definition on natural to guide them. So far, the FDA hasn't been able to do that. So why is it so difficult?
You ask 10 different consumers what natural is, and you're going to get 11 different answers.
That's Daniel Fabricant. He's CEO of the Natural Products Association in the US and a former FDA official.
They had an interesting case a few years ago when I was at the agency, Alexia Foods, where they were adding a natural color to something to make it red, and FDA said you can't call that natural, even though it was from beets.
We call it beetroot, I think, here.
Exactly. That's the problem, is it's very tough to kind of have a big, if you will, shotgun approach to it. You have to be surgical and really slice it commodity by commodity by commodity, I think. Have one standard for things like milk or dairy, one standard for packaged foods, it's so forth.
So it's not one size fits all, basically, when it comes to the adjective natural. It applies differently to different products.
Exactly. Like for beef products, which are regulated by USDA, you can add things like celery juice as a preservative versus adding nitrates and things like that, and you can call it all natural. Well, that celery juice wasn't in there initially, but if you took the FDA stance, you couldn't be able to have that. So you even have parts of the government using standards that are at odds with each other, or at least evaluating companies on standards that are at odds with each other.
You've really got to get this right, haven't you? Because if you don't, the word natural is just going to start becoming meaningless.
Yeah, it's such a big sector. I know people are very focused on organic, and organic is wonderful. And not that, don't let the good be the enemy of the great.
But everyone knows what organic means. There's standards applied to that which are clear, and everyone knows what they're talking about.
That's exactly right. As you had organic developed as really an agricultural standard first and foremost. You had those standards there, whereas natural has always been in somewhat of the beheld by the consumer.
On its website, the FDA states that, and I'm quoting here, it is difficult to define a food product as natural because the food has probably been processed and is no longer the product of the earth. And isn't the problem there that food companies, food manufacturers don't want to press the point because they might actually come to the conclusion that nothing that they sell is natural?
Well, I think some do and some don't. I think there's always going to be folks who try to, when there's not a standard, that try to hold a term hostage. But that's exactly why I think we need it, is to those companies that are really doing it right. It's a way to have that clarity in the marketplace. And those that aren't, that gives them something to strive for. Daniel
Fabricant. So the key is to read the small print on the label and read it very carefully. In China, where Mintel research shows that 70% of urban consumers don't trust domestically produced food, there's a whole industry around scouring food packaging for mistakes and suing. Kun Ho is a lawyer who used to work for China's equivalent of the FDA in Beijing. He says he spent most of his time dealing with people who made a living out of suing food retailers.
We have a very special group of people. I call them professional defective food buyers. Their main activities are going to the supermarket, locating some defective food, especially on the food labeling. They pick what's wrong in the labeling and they file a complaint to the FDA. If FDA rules that it is a food law or regulation violation, then they will be most likely to get 10 times compensation from the food seller.
Some people are making up to $45,000 a year doing this. But is the word natural on packaging in China as contentious as it is elsewhere in the world?
Natural food, so far we do not have any definition about how you can call food natural. And normally food manufacturers, most of them do not put such word on the food label because it's ambiguous.
Kunho. So when little things like words become problematic on labels, what does a company do? Kit Yarrow is Professor Emeritus at Golden Gate University in the US and a consumer psychologist.
For example, in grocery stores, what we see now is that in the produce section, produce will be displayed in baskets rather than in metal bins because that suggests that it's fresher and closer to the source. Or if you go to a bakery, in a grocery store, they'll have pictures of wheat rather than just the packaged bread. And the packaging itself looks a little bit more natural, a little bit more like it came from a bakery rather than that it was processed in a factory and then brought to the store. Other things that are used on more processed food, like canned products, are color cues. So, for example, green really does communicate freshness and organic, for example, and brown is a color associated with more natural food.
There's a lot of manipulation going on, isn't there?
On the one hand, having myself actually worked for consumer package companies, I feel like most of these companies have an essence of their product that they want to communicate. If you grow tomatoes and you can tomatoes, you want people to know how great the tomatoes are that are in the can. And the manufacturers actually go to great lengths to kind of showcase their beautiful tomatoes before they were chopped up and put into a can, possibly with sodium. But that's their source of pride.
But is natural a problem for food companies? I mean, is it as a concept? Because it's almost asking there not to be a company involved at all.
Well, it's just so complicated because consumers also want consistency. So if you really, they trust products where every time they eat it, it's going to taste the same, it's going to feel the same and look the same. That's kind of impossible when we're talking about, really pure and natural products. I mean, processing is part of what consumers like because it brings consistency and it brings a distribution that they appreciate. So they want a level of processing, whether they say it or not, because they want a brand that means something. Every time they buy it, they know exactly what they're going to get. Or maybe what they really want is the feeling that it hasn't been processed too much.
So they want the impossible. They want processed but natural.
Consumers have become very demanding. They do want the impossible in a way.
Professor Kit Yarrow. So we want to have our natural cake and eat it. But we're still stuck with our original problem. What is natural? And is it better for our bodies? I consulted Dimple Thakrar, a registered dietitian with the company Fresh Nutrition here in the UK.
Currently in the UK, the Food Standards Agency recommend that ingredients that are produced by nature, so in other words, not man-made and not interfered by man, so least processed foods.
So that's really key, isn't it? Least processed.
Yes.
Is natural always better for us?
So it's a really good question, actually, because if we were to have a completely natural diet, our diets would actually be quite limited. We are so used to having such a variety of foods in this day and age from all over the world. So in order for us to have that variety, there does need to be, for some foods, a little bit of processing. So it could be freezing, it could be canning, it could be pasteurising, it could be curing. If you think about all those foods that we eat on a daily basis, we will have some foods that are tinned, that are frozen. If we look at sort of the additives, they fall into 6 groups. So we've got antioxidants, colours, emulsifiers, flavour enhancers, preservatives and sweeteners. We use additives on an everyday basis in lots of our foods, and we preserve in lots of our ways. For example, fresh vegetables over frozen vegetables. If we were to store those fresh vegetables longer than their sell-by date, if you like, longer than they were good in terms of vitamins and minerals, we wouldn't be getting the same nutritional value as if we were to have frozen. When it's frozen, it doesn't decompose, if you like. So the vitamin C doesn't decompose and the bacteria doesn't start affecting the fruit and vegetables and eating away at it. It doesn't go off because the water in the frozen food is locked in. The bacteria can't feed off that food.
So natural is good if you can eat it straight away. It's not necessarily good if you have to store it.
The key point here would be variety. So absolutely, we're aiming for a minimum of 5 of your fruit or veg a day, a minimum. And if we can have a variety as much as possible. Now, if that means that some of that variety is using processed food, like freezing it or like tinned sweet corn, and the more variety we have, the much better variant of nutrients that we get.
Dimple Thakrar. She brings us to the end of this edition of The Food Chain. Many of you got in touch about last week's edition, which featured people's survival stories and what they ate. Amber in the UK said it was a fascinating insight into how our brain helps us adapt when in survival mode. And if you've missed any previous episodes, you can always download them in podcast form from the Food Chain website at bbc.com/foodchain. From producer Robert Champion, editor Audrey Tinlin, and myself, Manuela Zaragoza, that's it from this edition. The Food Chain is back again at the same time next week.